So thank you for joining the session. We're going to be covering a desired state configuration v3. And let's get started since we do, I think, have a lot of content and a limited time. First, thank you everyone for your feedback. I don't know, Michael, you added a slide. I don't know if there's anything else you want to cover here.
Yeah. The first three slides are PM slides, and then Jason and I'll talk about that stuff, and then we'll get out of the way, and then Steve can explain exactly how DSCB3 works, which is where you're all here. I wanted to say first, thank you. So you all saw on Monday the bicep example. That work happened because of this session last year. And as a follow-up to the session, Ben went and created an issue in the repo. It became a long discussion. At the time, we were just JSON and YAML, and now that's a reality. So if you were wondering, whenever I bring things up at Summit, does it actually happen ever? This is a good example where it happened right away. If we go to the next one, I just wanted to point out, when we presented this content to the MVPs a couple weeks ago, they had a very clear message for us, which is like, you're going to confuse the heck out of people because you keep calling this thing DSC, but this is a radically different thing that just happens to still work with all the old stuff. Got it. So we are really, really lucky to have very strong collaborations going on, starting with Winget, and Demetrius is here. If we have any questions, we can talk about Winget in detail. But yesterday, they did the public preview build that does support v3. We'll talk a little bit about what that means once we get into what the config schema looks like and that kind of stuff. But what's essentially happening there is a Winget config file. The schema is DSC v3 schema. And the same thing, of course, happening over here for Bicep. And then DevBox is starting to ingest Winget content. The message here is what we're trying to do is say, when you see configuration stuff, it's going to get branded and experienced to specific things, and your peers are going to see it as a solution. And then when you go look under the hood, it's just going to be DSC v3 if all goes well. I can't make that promise, but that's what we're trying to do. That's our vision for the future, is standardize things. And then you as the PowerShell community can say, oh, if my organization wants to extend this in some interesting way, I can just add PowerShell to it. And now I've got this superpower where anytime things are being configured, I can easily come contribute. I've got one more collaboration slide. Another thing that came up a bunch last week, if you've seen this in Windows Server, it's awesome. It's called OS config. They worked very closely with our team on getting their commandlets right. And then people were like, have you seen that there's a competitor to DSC in Windows Server now? It's not at all. We've been working with them for 5 years. Our team is not staffed up to do things like a CIS baseline and maintaining that content. That is a treadmill that you never get off. Their team's taking that on, and they're taking on the really interesting work, what if you're using 3 different configuration management platforms, including things like group policy and the old raccoons in the bag joke? How do you sort that out when it comes to things like baseline? So their team's taking that on. They already have a DSC resource. If you're using baselines in machine config today, you're already using this whole stack, which is machine config using DSC v2, calling their stack, applying baselines. This is a really good example where if we do our job, DSC just becomes part of the engine, and people don't even, they realize, oh, this is DSC. I know how to troubleshoot this, and it's got PowerShell involved. So a lot of this is just building out a strong platform that solutions can sit on top of. And I think that's it from me.
Yep. All right. So I think for the next, let's say 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to, I think one of the big feedback is really what Michael kind of mentioned, hey, we're calling it desired state configuration. It is truly very different, although there is a compatibility that we'll go into some detail on. But I'm going to try and go over what are the main differences between V1 and V2 and V3. And then hopefully we'll spend most of the remaining time on some demos. All right, so the old V1, one of the main things that people remember, if I'm assuming people in the audience here have used DSC V1, the LCM, right, Local Configuration Manager. So one of the big differences for V3, and we also did this with the V2, which I'll get into in follow-up slides, is that there's no local configuration manager anymore for V3, all right? Our expectation at this point is other solutions and other teams will kind of pick up that mantle. So, we showed OS config, we're working with them. Maybe they'll play some role in that space. Obviously, Azure Machine Config is our LCM in the cloud. And then later on, I'll talk about some of the stuff that we're doing in our platform to make it easier so that people or companies like Ansible or Chef Public can integrate so you can use them as the LCM. Or hypothetically, you could just write a very simple PowerShell script and have Task Scheduler run it, right? It depends on your use case. One of the other big things a lot of people asked is, hey, we used to write our configurations as PowerShell scripts using configuration keyword, and then we'd run it and it'd generate this MOF file, right? Guess what? MOF didn't take the industry by storm. And by the way, I came from WMI and SIM, so I'm very comfortable with MOF. I prefer MOF to JSON, but guess what? JSON kind of won out, and we'll cover some of that later in detail as well. So then V2 came around, and one of the big goals for V2 was really cross-platform compatibility, and that's all through this PS desire state configuration module. And this is where people also have some, naming is hard, and we don't, as Microsoft, do a great job. So there's PS DSC, and there's DSC, and now there's DSC V3. But the PS DSC module took care of the cross-platform capabilities, specifically get DSC resource, invoke DSC resource, right? So many of you maybe have used those. And this is where solutions like Chef and Puppet integrate with DSC and use those resources. And as I mentioned, cross-platform was the main goal of the V2 era. And then, now we're in the V3 era. And I'm going to go through, I have separate slides for each of these goals, but one of the main goals that really started this whole project is how do we get more resources available? How do we get more customers who are not PowerShell or even Windows users involved because they like the declarative model? It makes sense to them. So there's some bunch of work that we've done in terms of design to really, hopefully, significantly increase the number of resources so that people in this audience can benefit from those. As I mentioned, although MOF is an industry standard, it's predominantly only used by SIM, meaning WMI. And so we are moving towards stuff like YAML, JSON, and basically not trying to invent something new here. And we'll go over some of those details later as well. There are a bunch of new scenarios. So classic DSC was really almost entirely about systems management, right? Managing that particular node at a system level. We're going to go over some details of how the new V3, particularly working with like Winget and DevBox, enables different scenarios that you couldn't even do with V2. And then I kind of hinted, there's a bunch of specific designs we have in mind to make it actually easier for yourselves or tools like Chef, Puppet, Ansible, whatever, to integrate with the new V3 versus calling out the PowerShell using PSDSC and calling those commandlets. So let's go into the first one. So really, one of the key value propositions we're making with DSC V3 is really a standard way of exposing settings for applications and services. So the way we've defined it is pretty generic, and I'll go through some of those examples later. But you don't even have to use DSC V3 to call these things. Like it's I think, well defined that you could call those things directly if you really had to, although you're going to get, in my opinion, additional value going through the DSC layer. And as part of that, it means you can write your resources in any language, right? So you can still do it in PowerShell. Like we still support that. I'm still the engineer manager for PowerShell. So I won't say prefer it, but I think I prefer you to use whatever language you or your team is most well versed in so you can get there faster, right? So if you want to do it in Python, in C#, Rust, whatever, by all means, the only thing that is required for V3 is an ability for the engine to call a command line to invoke your stuff. And we'll go into some of those examples later. Another thing that we do a little bit differently in the V3 world is in the V2 or V1 world, you had to do get set test. In V3, you kind of have to have an option to choose what is actually appropriate for your resource, right? I'll have an example later, this new concept called assertion, where guess what? That's really just a test. Like it doesn't implement anything else, but you can use it with a get and set. And there are other cases where maybe it is read-only. So there is this OS info resource that ships with DCV3, and you can only read information about the operating system. You can't change it, right? Like it's 64-bit. You can't make it 32-bit. And then even you don't have to even implement test, right? I think a lot of cases that I saw, the way people implement test is they just do it their own get, and they do a comparison, and then they return whether it succeeded or not. So if your resource doesn't have any special validation, so for example, like a package manager should have an implementation of test where if you say the desired state is that this package is within this version range, right? Then the synthetic test won't know anything about that. The synthetic test is purely looking at the inputs and the result and doing a straight diff of the two things, right? So if that isn't sufficient, then you will have to implement test. One of the other things, as someone who wrote some of these V3 resources, it came clear like, hey, with the old ensure, which is now called _exist, and the reason for that is that it made more sense when you're setting it and then getting it back to be called exist true or false versus ensure present absent, which only in my mind makes sense setting it, and when you get it, it's kind of confusing. But anyways, for your resource, I think a lot of people, when they had to support ensure or exist, they basically in their set code had logic that says if it says this, then do this kind of thing. So to simplify that, you can actually just implement the delete operation, and then the engine will notice that your resource supports delete, and if the configuration says exist false, instead of passing that to you for set, it'll call your delete operation, right? So it makes it, again, simpler for the resource author. All right, so we talked about industry standards. And by the way, I'm trying to go a little bit faster this because we can get to some of the demos, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or do we want to take them at the end? Either way, I guess.
Let's take them at...
Maybe easier to take it at the end. So jot it down, and we'll cover it at the end. All right.
Because then I'll walk the microphone out.
Yeah.
That way it'll be in the video too.
All right. So we are, I'll say this. Like, I'm not personally a fan of JSON, but I think JSON has won out, right? So therefore, we're leveraging JSON, and one of the big benefits of using JSON is that pretty much for any programming language, including C# and PowerShell, there's a way to convert serialize and deserialize from JSON, so we don't need to invent something new here. The configuration docs themselves are based off of ARM template syntax. It is no longer a strict subset. We've kind of deviated in some areas, but it is very close. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we're able to have bicep integration, and we'll have a demo of that towards the end. And by the way, for folks who don't use Azure or have just local scenarios, it doesn't matter that it's based on ARM template syntax. You can still use it locally. Like it's just using the syntax. So if you're familiar with it or have tooling around that, you can use that again. And finally, we do support the configuration docs themselves to be in JSON, but you can also do it in YAML. And we'll show this going forward, and it's not fully supported yet, but it's a work in progress, like bicep. All right, so let's cover some of the new things that you can do with V3 that wasn't possible with the V1 and V2, that hopefully will get folks thinking about how to adopt V3 going forward. So one of the big ones is export.
Let me inject one comment as we go from that slide to this slide. A common question that I want to get in front of is, okay, so all my resources are still backwards compatible. He'll talk about that. My configurations right now are written in PowerShell. Now you're saying that their configurations are in JSON and YAML and bicep. So how do I get from one to the other? As he goes through this next slide, what you'll see, we thought about things like tools that could convert. What you're going to see is there's so many new capabilities. It's not obvious exactly what people want. So we've been dragging our feet a little bit on figuring that part of it out to get feedback. So be thinking about, as you see the new stuff, how would you want to go from the old thing to the new thing? And you can help steer the ship towards the right answer.
Yep, and I think I have a slide on transition unless you removed it. Okay, so we'll cover that in a bit, so hold off on that. Hold your angst. All right, so the big thing about export, right, is I think that in the real world, a lot of times people aren't crafting MOFs or JSONs and then applying it. They're probably tinkering with the system using the GUI. And what export allows you to do, assuming there's resources behind it, right? And we're working with a bunch of Microsoft first-party teams to make sure there's resources over time. But the idea is that you would configure this server or client machine, and then you can run export and take out all the settings and then apply it somewhere else. Apply it whether on a different physical machine or apply it in the cloud or whatever the case may be, right? So that's what export is allowing. Again, DCV1 specifically with the LCM running as a service really is intended for systems level management, like managing the whole system. Whereas with V3, particularly as we're working with WinGet and DevBox teams, you can now think of it more as like you're managing applications per user, right? So there are going to be some interesting scenarios there where, let's say that you're an individual developer and you're working across, let's say, the DC repo, which is primarily in Rust, and you're working on a PowerShell repo, which is primarily in C#. So now you can have settings applied to your VS Code to make sure that they're appropriate for each project, as an example, or for different users. There's also this newer concept, which I'll show in a bit. You can declare that your configuration requires elevation, or you could also declare that your configuration requires restricted. Restricted meaning non-admin, right? There's going to be cases, particularly if you're using, for example, WinGet, where if you're elevated, guess what? It's probably going to install it for all users under program files. Whereas if you're restricted, meaning a non-admin user at the time, then you really want to install it for just for yourself, right? So there are different cases there. So there's a bunch of new concepts. I'm not necessarily going to go through all these in detail, but I'm just going to explain them. The first new one is assertions. So, and I'll demo this one. Basically, in your configuration, if you want to do, like if you had the old group policy, if you're familiar with that with the group policy filter, then you could actually say, hey, I'm going to deploy this across all my machines. And then I'm going to have this assertion up front to say, is this applicable to the system? And then if it isn't, then it won't apply. All right. We have this thing called groups now, where basically it's just a nested configuration. We have adapters, and this is how PowerShell 7 support and Windows PowerShell support is enabled. Basically, if you have this other class of resources, then an adapter basically makes it look like a v3 resource, right? And I'll show some of those demos. But for example, one of the things that we are looking at is, does it make sense to have a Python adapter? Because I think in that case, we can get a lot more Linux developers writing resources because they're probably not going to write PowerShell. And then finally, a new thing that isn't enabled yet, but we do have designs, and it's something I'm trying to work on in whatever time I have, which is supporting extensions. So the ability for other tooling to extend capabilities of DSC so that we don't need it in DSC itself. So kind of think of it as like a module, if you will, for PowerShell, that it will enhance and add new capabilities that we don't need to just have in the engine itself. All right, so one of the things I mentioned earlier is, hey, what about higher level tools, or what about yourselves, right? Like you want to integrate with DSC. So obviously it's open source, so you can always look at the source code, fork it if you have to, and stuff like that. But there are some specific things that we got feedback from, for example, the Azure Machine Config team as they use V2, that we try to incorporate into DSC so that every application doesn't have to do the same thing. So for example, before we do a set, the engine will do a test, right? So if you're already in the desired state, then we actually don't try to call the resource to do set. So in that case, for you to kind of maintain item potency, being able to reapply the config and not have side effects, it's actually easier, because as long as you're in desired state, we'll skip that set as part of the overall configuration. And then also, a lot of times people will do a set, but guess what? Set doesn't necessarily it tells you whether it succeeded, but doesn't tell you what the current state is. So the engine will always do a get afterwards and return that result as well, right? So because we find that a lot of applications end up doing that anyway, so let's just do it on their behalf. As I mentioned, JSON communication, but also more than just that, like all the output can be JSON, meaning the results. All the tracing that DSC engine provides can also be formatted as JSON, so that a higher level tool, like for example, WinGet, can consume it and present it in different ways. And even progress information can be output as JSON, so that again, a different tool can consume that and present it to the user in more interesting ways than what we do. Because we're strictly a command line tool. All right, so let me cover some parts of transition. All right, so I think the key thing here is intended to say, if you have DC V1 and V2 today and it's working for you, I say keep using it. Like, it's not gonna go away anytime soon. It's the same thing I say about Windows PowerShell 5.1 versus PowerShell 7. If it's working, you don't need to move unless you're trying to use some of the new capabilities in V3, right? And then we'll have to figure out how to best help you to transition. One of the key things, again, this is also true for PowerShell 7 as we develop that one, is like it is designed to work side by side, right? So it doesn't replace V1 and V2. You could have V1 running with LCM, you could have a script executing V2, and then you can also have V3 configuration. Now, obviously, there is some risk there. If you're familiar again with GPO, there's this whole resulting set of policies where a bunch of different things are touching the same thing. So there's no help for you on that. You have to kind of know that you're not applying different things trying to change the same thing. So we don't currently have any intended plan to author a tool that will convert your existing MOFs to JSON. As mentioned by Michael, this is not a trivial thing, but also, we do have limited resources, and for us, it's really focusing on future value versus necessarily existing. But I do think this would be a good opportunity for the community to think about if there is sufficient interest to kind of build that tooling.
One of the things I'd be really interested, I can create a GitHub issue on this, but just to put it out there, maybe we just do an adapter and just say, if you already have a MOF or even a script, we just have an adapter in V3 and treat it like a composite configuration was in V1. And then you can sprinkle on the V3 stuff above and below it and make it. But I don't even know if that process makes sense for everybody. So Gail says, no, do not do that. So
I think such
that's
a
why I'm
solution,
asking.
yeah, such a solution technically is actually not hard. I just don't know whether that's something we want to support and promote, right? Because it's probably not a best practice. Similarly, like actually, maybe I can show because I'm going to skip the demos here. So let me see if I can get out of this for now. Let's go to VS Code. All right. So before we get to, let me see. I'll just show a few things here. Oh, too small. Okay, I'll make it. Is that okay in the back? Okay. All right. So I think the first one I wanted to just show is how do you use existing PowerShell-based resources? Actually, it's more than just PowerShell. Like you can also use old, what's called binary resources, which are implemented in WMI, or even script-based resources. It doesn't have to be PowerShell class-based resources. So one of the things, there's, let's say, two different ways of doing it. All right. So what you see as this resource, this is the actual adapter that allows DSC to know to call PowerShell XE versus if you were to use PowerShell 7. So I'm going to make some changes here, but you don't commit it. So I think we called the other one PowerShell here, right? So for example, if you explicitly need to use Windows PowerShell because you know that the resource requires it, then you would specify Windows PowerShell. Otherwise, if you want to use PowerShell 7, then you can specify this type, right? So it's very explicit. Now, one of the fixes I made recently means that you could actually eliminate that and make these top level, and this will also work. And the way this works is that, and this was how it's intended to work, but there was a bug. Basically, in this case, and this I think this is a little bit more natural for people to think about, is you're just calling the module with the resource, and then of course the properties. So DSC will already know like, hey, this is not a v3 resource, but there's an adapter behind it. So what it's going to do behind the scenes is actually going to craft a new configuration that looked like what I had on the screen before. So if I do Control Z, right? So I had this wrapper resource, and so that gets executed, and then we unwrap the result and present it to you. So one of the key things to keep in mind though, because although this shorthand looks nicer, and maybe more intuitive as you get used to v3. The downside to this approach versus the other one is that DC doesn't know that you have a bunch of these, right? So each of these, like in this case I have two of them, will spawn its own instance of PowerShell. Versus when you have this wrapper example, we know that we're going to only spawn one instance of PowerShell and call these resources with that same instance, right? So again, it's not probably a big deal, but just something to keep in mind. Let me jump to assertion real quick. So in this case, let's see. So this is just using the Windows registry, which obviously won't work on Mac OS and Linux, which we also support with v3. So there's an assertion here. So this is the resource. And an assertion is actually a type of group resource, meaning that you can have a full nested configuration of whatever test you want. And again, the way the assertion works is that whether, so I'm going to run this. I'm presuming we have everything set up correctly, and I'll make this bigger. Let me see, and hopefully the black is okay. All right. Okay, so if I do DSC config, let's just do a get. Oh, actually, let me make sure. So just to be clear, this is expected to fail because it's a test case, all right? And the way it's going to fail is that it's going to look in the registry for current version, system root, and it's going to check whether or not it's on the L drive. And I deliberately picked L because it's very unlikely your Windows is installed on L. Originally it was Z, and guess what? I think if you're on WinRE, it might be the Z drive. So anyways, so this should fail, all right? So this is designed to fail. And when it fails, it basically means it won't run this other registry part, which is just retrieving, well, this doesn't exist anyway. Well, it's checking whether this exists. All right, let's see. And I think this is under examples assertion. Yep. So basically it says the assertion failed for the registry check. Obviously there's maybe work we could do to make that a little bit easier to understand. Like it's gonna be hard to get the line number, but anyways, it's telling you that this type is what caused the failure because the drives don't match. And you kind of see that it didn't run this part at all because there's a dependency here. So it says that this assertion needs to succeed before anything else gets run. Let me see. Oh, this is another new thing. So if you wanted to have, so you can have nested configurations using group like this. So it's all inline, right? If you have super complex ones, you may not want to have this giant configuration that handles, let's say, network compute and storage. You may want to have those as separate things. So include allows you to actually have those as separate configuration files, whether they're YAML or JSON, and you can basically include them, kind of like how you do it in C# and C and stuff like that. Let me see anything that's interesting. Oh, I don't have it here, but one other thing I didn't mention, I'm going to show real quick before maybe I hand it off because we're going to run out of time here. And I'll be around afterwards if people have questions or want to see other stuff. So we also have I'm going to call it a proof of concept WMI adapter because it's not feature complete yet. All right. Here's an example. So basically, WMI has a lot of information in it. Like it has thousands of classes, right, across multiple namespaces. So why wouldn't we just allow you to access WMI directly so you don't have to call a PowerShell script to access WMI, for example? And so in this case, we can run this one. This is going to get the Win32 operating system. And the way this is designed currently is that if you specify these properties and they're empty, then it's going to just retrieve those properties. If you have, I don't have it here, but if you have, well, let me run this one first. This was under WMI adapter. This was a test one, right? Because otherwise, if you don't specify that and you leave the properties blank, it's going to retrieve everything, which you may or may not want.
Since I reinstalled it, might have to repopulate the resource cache. Oh, okay.
So there's a bunch of stuff, but the first one is only retrieving the properties because I specified it. And again, if you go back to the configuration, I'm also retrieving BIOS and processor, and I did not specify the properties. So in that case, it's going to return everything, right? And whether or not you find that valuable, but for example, if I wanted to filter it, let me see, what's something, actually, I should have had network adapter, but basically the idea here is that if you had values for these properties, then it'd be applied as a filter. So basically, behind the scenes, it's constructing a WQL query. All right, I'm gonna hand it off to you because otherwise we're gonna run out of time.
No, let's skip Andy time.
You want to skip to Andy first?
Yeah.
All right. So Andy's going to show bicep.
And I'm going to be. So while it's connecting, I'm going to tell you what we're going to demo. Oh, question? Go ahead.
I'll just talk loud. Just a quick question. I just wondered, in that example you just showed of grabbing that WMI information to output that, for example, to JSON. Is it just like a switch on the command to output that? How would you output that in JSON?
Yep. So that's a good question. So by default, DC, if it knows that you're running interactively, meaning that the output isn't redirected, it's going to give you pretty YAML because it assumes that you're in front of it and it's just easier to read. If you ever redirect it to something else, then it'll automatically become JSON lines.
File.
Yeah, if you redirect to file, or if you're in PowerShell, redirect it to a variable, it'll become JSON. All right. But there are command line switches to force it to be YAML, JSON, or pretty JSON if you want to see all the indenting and stuff like that. Okay, so the question is the WMI demo specifically, I only used it to show how to retrieve information. Part of that is that the WMI adapter today doesn't support set. So that is something that will be added later. But it's a little bit more complex than that because some of the ways you actually make changes in WMI is you have to call methods. And so the question is going to be, I haven't thought through how to make it less explicit that you're calling a method because I think it's not as intuitive, but that will come at some point. Now, obviously with PowerShell-based resources that have set, you could have done a config set and that would have done what it's supposed to do. So that does work. So just to be clear, the WMI adapter today only supports get.
Part of the scenarios I've seen also, so you're going to declare the state of a server. What we have done in the past is say you write your configuration in PowerShell. Instead of producing the MOF and taking that to the machine, you hold compilation until you get to the machine. So you take the whole PS1 script, compile it to destination, and then produce the MOF and go do things. Well, the reason was you didn't know everything at the build in the source control. You didn't know it until you got, so like even, is this 2019 or 2022? Something like that. So now you could have an assertion that will go get what version of Windows is this, how much memory, whatever the case may be, and then have different section of the configuration run under each of those assertions. But it's still predictable output because like you're always going to get the same thing on 2019, always get the same thing on 2022, but it can be in the same source.
So then the follow-up is, can you then also use that information that you're getting back from WMI to like populate some variables that can be used later on in the config?
So yes, I didn't show this, and if we have time, maybe towards the end I can kind of show it. Like as part of adopting ARM template syntax, you get parameters, you get variables, you get expressions, right? And as part of expressions, or think of expressions as kind of like a small script. Hello? Okay. So as part of an expression, we also support functions, right, that you can call to do certain things. So one of the functions is get this value of this variable or get the value of this parameter. And via parameters, you can also, I'm going to just predict future questions. You can have the equivalent of a secure string or secure object, right? And by the way, secure string in DSC and ARM, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I'm going to say syntax, but semantics isn't the same as C#. There's no like encryption. What it guarantees is that we're not going to emit the value of it to something, right? So it's read only basically, or we have only read it and it's write only if you think of it that way. All right, but basically one of the ways we've deviated from ARM is we have additional functions that only make sense at the computer level versus at an infrastructure level, right? For example, we added environmental variable because you may want to, during a configuration, get maybe the user profile or the path or whatever, right? Whatever environmental variable, you can retrieve it in a DC config via the, I think we just called it env function, stuff like that. And as we have more people use DSC configurations and have a need for maybe new functions that make sense, open those up as issues in the repo and we'll evaluate those and we can add those.
So it's the full subset of ARM expressions and functions plus more for DSC.
Okay, so the question is, for those familiar with ARM templates, there are a lot of functions you can use in expressions. So currently with what we have shipped, it is a subset based on what we thought people would use initially and based on our time and resources, all right? There are some functions in ARM templates that actually doesn't make any sense in the DC world because it is only for the cloud, all right? So those will not exist, but the intent is that we would have close parity with ARM for a lot of the stuff that you probably use for runtime stuff. All right, are any other questions or we're still trying to get, yes? Parallel resources. Oh, so the question basically was about parallelism. So for those who've been following the project since its inception, there was at one moment in time a parallel group resource. And I had created that because you know what? It's actually not too hard to, well, the easy part is to spawn a bunch of resources and let them run. The hard part is waiting for them to finish, although that's not that hard. One of the things that we talked about is we have no guarantees and it's entirely up to the user to know that these things can be run in parallel, right? They don't clobber each other. There's no sequencing needed and stuff like that. Because we think that's currently a hard problem to put onto the user, we basically deferred the idea of parallelism to the future. So I think if there's a good scenario and we can make it less problematic, because I think if you just dump everything as parallel and it runs on one system and it happens that to just work and you now deploy it to hundreds, thousands of machines and it doesn't, it's going to be very hard to troubleshoot. And it will require the author of the configuration to know that these things are safe to run in parallel, right? So you'll get efficiency, but it's going to be less consistent due to the nature of parallelism, right? Okay, I'm going to simplify your question. Can you expand a bit more on export and how that's going to work? So export is a new concept in V3 that didn't exist in V1 and V2. So you can author a PowerShell class-based resource with a new static export method to participate. All right, so you don't need to write. You can still write it in PowerShell. Obviously, when you do this, V1 and V2 have no idea of this export thing, so it won't make use of it. All right. But resources need to explicitly support export for this to work. So if you have a configuration document that has a whole bunch of resources in it, each of those today needs to support export. There is an open issue I have in the repo that I intend to fix again sometime, which is if you have a resource that only supports get, and you provided enough information for it to know what to get, like all the key properties, the filter, whatever, that should work when you do an export. Like that's the intent, but it won't. Because that's not supported today, that won't work. So as of right now, every resource that you have in the config needs to explicitly support the export operation for you to export it. All right. So basically, fundamentally, all it's going to do is DC Engine is going to look at your config and walk it'll create the dependency based on how you declare it, and then for each one, it's going to find out whether or not it supports the export operation, which is defined in the resource manifest. And if it doesn't, it's going to fail today. Okay, so the question is, what's the difference between export and get? So in the V2 world, you may have heard something called get all as a concept. It's basically like an enumeration, right? So in DSC, even like V1 and V2, when you do a get, let's say that you have IAS set up and you have multiple websites, then if you're doing a get, you're getting one website out of all of them. Whereas if you're doing an export, you're getting all the websites. It's an enumeration of all the websites, or whatever the resource wants to enumerate. So one, I'll just say one more thing, because I know people maybe will hit upon this when they try playing with this. So one of the things that we are thinking about how to resolve is that, like, if you're on a Windows system, you probably don't want to write this super complex configuration that says export this parts of the registry, export this part of the file system, this application, this whatever, right? Because you now have to know everything before you export it. There's an idea that is supported, but we don't have an implementation yet, which is called an exporter resource. And basically, the exporter resource would have intrinsic knowledge to say, hey, I'm going to, hopefully, you'll have this exporter resource is called, let's say, Windows, right? And Windows knows, hey, you're trying to export everything, and I know that these things have resources behind it, so I'm going to call these behind the scenes. So you can just declare export everything versus, you can always declare export these things, right? But that's the idea. So that doesn't exist yet, but it's coming. Andy.
All right, so this segue makes more sense if we rewind when I came up here, which was you guys just saw a bunch of YAML configuration documents, right? Well, YAML's not amazing. I mean, it's better than JSON, but really it's just like a top cover for JSON, which is just how it's like the object notation for JavaScript, right? It's your program objects in somewhat human readable format, but it's not designed for us humans. Bicep, on the other hand, was actually written by developers for humans to read and write these configuration documents, or in their case, like ARM files for Azure. But guess what? Under the covers, as we talked about, DSC is just a subset of ARM. So we've actually got a demo here where this is using the Bicep extension available on the VS Code Marketplace. This is out and available. I've got an experimental feature enabled first in my Bicep config, which is desired state configuration set to true. That lets me in this Bicep file set my target scope to desired state configuration, and then write code that looks really familiar. This kind of is YAML, but it's as Bicep code. So I've got a parameter here for enabling light mode, and then I've got a few resources. This is that Microsoft.Windows registry resource that's available. It's a proof of concept in DSC v3, and I've just got a few of these resources set up using functions like, concat this variable for the whole key path prefix, and set the value, that dword value, to whatever I passed in. And you'll notice there's better ways to write this, and I'll show you the better way, but this is the working way that kind of showed how much we still have to do for DSC. But I'm going to go ahead and build this file, which in VS Code is the build task, which is going to run build ARM template. So Bicep build my ARM template. That ARM template gets created. It's this now demo.json file. So this is the ARM that you would have otherwise written, or essentially like written a version of when writing the YAML. But instead you got to write it in the Bicep. And now at this point, Bicep is kind of out of the picture. I'm going to run a terminal command, one that should be pretty familiar, DSC with some debug logging. I'm going to pass a parameter, that parameter that I had enabled as input here, light mode enabled. Going to set that to 0 with the file demo.json, which I built from that Bicep and then didn't touch. And I'm going to run that in admin so I can actually execute it. And sure enough, my app color theme and Windows color theme just changed. So this is working. I'm not using anything that isn't available to anybody else. This is the latest DSC from GitHub, and I don't mean that I built it. I mean I just downloaded the release, and like I said, the Bicep extension on the marketplace with that experimental feature enabled. Now, the Bicep code here, if I will respond to my click, please respond to my click. Slow internet is our other problem today, but hey, thanks to Gail for fixing the HDMI output from my new MacBook Air. So we've actually got, yes, okay. So I'm gonna move over to my enhanced demo, which is really, come on.
Do you want to switch it back to light mode to make it easier to project?
Yes. I promise I just clicked that terminal. Come on. Oh, okay. The enhanced version of this demo is how I wrote it as a developer who's loosely familiar with Bicep, like reading the documentation, going, how should I write this? And it didn't work because it kind of showed what is missing in DSC as it parses the ARM. But we're going to work on it. And when we support all the functions that it used in the ARM, like in that configuration document that was run, then it will just work and you'll get to write this with loops and with better variables and with string interpolation. So here we go. Demo enhanced. You'll see all the to-dos where I try to run this through DSC and went, oh, we need to support that. But much simpler, right? I was going to have this color mode string as my param for light or dark. And then based on that, instead of like having to know it was 1 or 0, I was just going to use bicep code to say, oh, hey, compare that to the string and then a ternary statement or like an if-else conditional and set the value. So I didn't actually have to like deal with that when I ran it on the command line. And then instead of like setting out 4 different resources, I was just going to have a couple of variables here, like a list of objects where I had those keys set, like accent color menu, to use that string interpolation that put a format into our ARM file, and we need to support that too. But just write it like that. And lastly, just one version of resource here, which uses this for key and keys to loop over and just build up my several registry keys. And this actually, it does build. If I hit that demo enhanced.json, which I've already got open right here, same exact thing. It's just if you run this in DSC, the very first thing you'll hit is we don't have the equals, but I'm on it. That's actually probably what I'm going to do next week when I'm back and fix it.
Let me just add one thing if it's not obvious, which is if you enjoy writing DSC classic configurations in PowerShell script using configuration keyword, Bicep replaces that capability, right? So if you need to do loops or conditionals and stuff, this would be a good time to learn Bicep.
So you can tell he was connecting to something called DevBox. If you don't know what that is, I'll explain it. It's just an Azure service. It's like virtual desktops, but they've wrapped it for developers. So the idea is whenever you create the farm, you associate it with, you associate it with a Git repo. And so then you say, there's this much capacity for my team. I got 5 developers. They can spin up 5 workstations. It's mapped to this Git repo. Well, they're just, they're presenting this at build, but they're just taking a config YAML that's DSCV3 and putting it in the repo. So if the provisioning engine for DevBox sees that there's a config file in the repo, it will automatically make all those workstations get configured and say, I want VS Code with these plugins. I want all my posh. I want whatever. And your farm automatically gets stood up in a predictable way for your project, instead of trying to communicate with your developers, say, oh, we thought you were going to use Postman for that, and blah, blah, blah.
I think we're at time. Any last questions? Otherwise, you can always find any of Microsoft folks outside, and we can dig deep into other topics.
Sweet.
The comment was he liked it.
If you saw this already, it's because Jason stole it from me and already presented it, but this was my demo.
Was there a hand in the back? Okay, otherwise, I think we are at time in, and I want to make sure we respect whoever's coming in for the next session. Oh, it's lunch? Get in line. All right.